July 11, 1944. A German Tiger tank commander watched in disbelief as his invincible 56-ton war machine exploded from a direct hit at over 1,000 yards, the shot coming from what he thought was just another inferior American Sherman. The Tiger tank had never been knocked out at such range by a Sherman before, and German intelligence was baffled by reports flooding in from multiple fronts. But how could America's supposedly weak tin can tanks suddenly punch through the thickest armor in the German arsenal from distances that should have been impossible? By the summer of 1944, Germany was fighting a war on two fronts that stretched their resources thin as wire. Steel became precious as gold, and the finest German engineers worked day and night to build tanks that could turn the tide. In the rolling fields of Normandy and the mud of the Eastern Front, one machine ruled the battlefield with absolute terror. The Tiger tank sat like a metal giant among lesser beasts, its 80mm gun capable of punching through enemy armor at distances that seemed impossible. Inside the cramped steel belly of Tiger 131, Hauptmann Klaus Weber adjusted his headset and peered through the commander's periscope. The 42-year-old veteran had commanded tanks since the Polish campaign, and he knew the sound of his engine like a father knows his child's heartbeat. His Tiger weighed 56 tons of solid German engineering, protected by armor 4 inches thick at the front. The massive 80mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at over a mile away. Weber had seen Russian T-34s explode like firecrackers when his gunner found the mark. He had watched British Churchills burn like torches in the desert sand. But it was the American Sherman that made Weber almost feel sorry for the enemy. Intelligence reports called them Ronsons after the cigarette lighter, because they lit up so fast when hit. The Sherman M4 weighed only 30 tons and carried a puny 75mm gun that could barely scratch a Tiger's paint at long range. American tank crews were brave, Weber admitted, but they were riding into battle in metal coffins. Their thin armor was like paper against his mighty 88. In training, German crews learned that 3 or 4 Shermans had to attack one Tiger to have any chance of winning. And even then, the Tiger usually walked away from the fight. Weber's radio crackled with morning reports from other tank commanders across the front. The usual stuff about supply shortages and maintenance delays. Then something strange caught his attention. Lieutenant Hoffman from the 2nd Company was describing a strange encounter from the previous day. His voice sounded confused, almost worried. He spoke of a Sherman that had fired at his Tiger from what seemed like an impossible distance. The shot had missed, but it came closer than any Sherman should have been able to manage. Weber shook his head and dismissed the report. Hoffman was young and probably just nervous. But, as the morning radio chatter continued, more odd stories filtered through. A Tiger destroyed at long range near Caen. Another knocked out by what witnesses swore was a single Sherman firing from over 1,000 yards away. The reports made no sense. Shermans simply could not do such things. Their guns were too weak, their crews too inexperienced. Weber had been fighting Americans for months, and he knew their limits. Something was changing on the battlefield, but Weber could not yet see what it was. 3 days later, Weber got his first real look at what the Americans had been hiding. His Tiger sat hull down behind a stone farmhouse near Villers-Bocage when the convoy appeared on the distant ridge. At first, it looked like any other American supply column, but something was different. These Shermans moved with a smoothness Weber had never seen before. Their guns stayed level even as they rolled over rough ground, like they were glued in place. The old Shermans always bounced and swayed, their guns pointing every direction except where they needed to go. Weber raised his binoculars and studied the lead tank. It looked like a Sherman, but the turret seemed taller and the gun barrel looked longer than usual. Strange markings covered the sides, and thick metal plates had been welded to the front armor. This was not the thin-skinned Sherman he knew. His gunner, Feldwebel Kruger, squinted through his own scope and whistled softly. The American tank commander stood tall in his hatch, scanning the horizon with confidence Weber had never seen in Sherman crews before. Then Weber noticed the supply trucks following behind the tanks. Massive vehicles loaded with crates marked in English. One truck carried nothing but spare tank parts, more than Weber's entire company had seen in months. Another truck held rows of gleaming artillery shells, each one perfectly made and ready for battle. The Americans seemed to have endless supplies of everything they needed. Weber's own Tiger had been waiting 2 weeks for replacement track links, but these American tanks looked fresh from the factory. The convoy stopped near a crossroads, and Weber watched in amazement as the Americans set up what looked like a mobile repair shop in minutes. Mechanics swarmed over the tanks with tools Weber had not seen since before the war. They changed entire engine parts like they were changing light bulbs. One crew completely replaced a damaged gun barrel in less than an hour. Something that would take Weber's mechanics a full day if they had the parts at all. But the real shock came when Weber saw the ammunition. Crate after crate of shells that looked different from anything in the intelligence reports. These rounds were longer and sharper than normal Sherman ammunition, with pointed tips that gleamed like silver. Kruger had captured American shells before, and they were always blunt and simple. These new rounds looked deadly serious, built for one purpose only. Weber felt a cold knot form in his stomach as he counted the tanks below. 12 Shermans, but they moved and acted like no Shermans he had ever fought. Their crews worked with the smooth skill of veterans, not the clumsy fumbling of green American soldiers. Something had changed in the American army, and Weber was beginning to understand that his side might not know about it yet. The reports from other commanders suddenly made terrible sense. The moment that shattered everything Weber believed came at dawn on August 12, 1944. His Tiger had taken position on Hill 117, a perfect spot that gave him clear sight lines across the valley for over 1,500 yards. No Sherman had ever threatened him from such a distance. Weber felt safe behind 4 inches of the finest German steel. His 80 Edlimer gun ready to destroy anything that dared to show itself in the morning mist. The first American tank appeared as a dark shadow moving along the tree line, impossibly far away. Weber smiled and told Kruger to wait. Let the foolish Americans come closer where they belonged, within the killing range of their weak guns. But the Sherman stopped at what Weber estimated was 1,200 yards and began to turn its turret toward his position. Weber laughed out loud. No Sherman could hurt a Tiger at that distance. It was like throwing rocks at a castle wall. The flash from the Sherman's gun seemed tiny across the valley. Just a small wink of light in the dawn gloom. Weber was still smiling when the world exploded around him. The American shell punched through his Tiger's front armor like it was made of cardboard, not steel. The sound was beyond deafening, a crack of thunder that seemed to split the earth itself. Kruger screamed as red-hot metal fragments filled the fighting compartment. The smell of burning oil and worse things made Weber gag as he struggled to understand what had just happened. His hands shook as he grabbed the radio and called for help, but his voice came out as a broken whisper. The Tiger that had never been hurt. The machine that had made him feel like a god of war was dying around him. Smoke poured from holes that should not exist. The 80mm gun that had killed so many enemy tanks now pointed uselessly at the sky, its mount twisted beyond repair. Weber had to crawl out through the commander's hatch as flames began to lick at his feet. Standing in the mud beside his burning Tiger, Weber stared across the valley at the Sherman that had destroyed his world. It sat there calmly, like nothing important had happened. Just another day's work for the American crew inside. Weber realized with sick clarity that everything German intelligence had told him was wrong. The Americans had not just built better tanks, they had built better ammunition, better training, and better tactics. They had turned their simple Shermans into long-range killers that could reach out and touch any German tank, no matter how thick its armor or how safe it felt. Weber pulled out his field notebook with trembling hands and wrote words that would have been impossible just minutes before. The Americans are no longer the enemy we knew. They have become something we never prepared to fight. By the time Weber staggered away from the burning wreck, the valley was alive with thunder. More Shermans appeared from the mist, their silhouettes sharp against the rising sun. Each one carried the same long, predatory barrel that had torn open his Tiger, and each moved with a fluidity that spoke of careful design and endless drills. Shells cracked through the air like giant whips, each report followed by the dull, stomach-punching impact of German armor shattering in the distance. Weber turned to see smoke columns rising where other Tigers had once stood, in proud defiance. The battlefield was turning into a graveyard of giants, their corpses smoldering in grotesque poses as if in disbelief at their own defeat. He stumbled toward a hedgerow for cover, every step heavy with disbelief. How could the invincible be broken so suddenly, so utterly? The answer echoed in every blast across the fields. The Americans had changed the rules of the game. Their new weapon, what Weber would later learn, was the 76 mm high-velocity gun-firing, advanced armor-piercing rounds, had stripped the Tiger of its mystique. No longer could German crews hide behind the certainty that range and armor made them untouchable. The knowledge cut deeper than shrapnel. For years, the Tiger had been a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Allied tankers approached it with dread, whispers of its 80 mm gun running through their ranks like ghost stories. Even if a Tiger missed its first shot, the fear it inspired often made its opponents clumsy, rash, desperate. Now that fear was evaporating. Weber could see it in the way the Shermans advanced, not cautiously, not timidly, but with a predator's confidence. They moved like hunters who had discovered their prey was mortal after all. Weber pressed his back against the damp hedge, clutching his pistol though he knew it was useless. Around him, the valley roared with the collapse of German steel. A Tiger on the far ridge tried to pivot its turret, but before it could fire, a shot from over 1,000 yards punched straight through the mantlet, detonating inside with a flash that lifted the turret clean off its hull. The explosion rolled across the fields like a wave, rattling Weber's ribs. He had seen tanks die before, but never so easily, never so helplessly. Memories of his early campaigns flooded back, columns of Shermans burning in North Africa, their crews scrambling from the hatches as his 80 mm cut them down one after another. He remembered how the men of his company would laugh afterward, convinced that no army could match German steel and discipline. He had believed it too, believed it so deeply that even the prospect of defeat on the Eastern Front had not shaken his faith in the Tiger. But here, in Normandy's fields, faith was no shield against cold reality. Kruger's voice still echoed in his ears, that sharp scream when the shell struck home. Weber had not seen if his gunner made it out. The thought twisted in his chest. But he shoved it aside with the instinct of a soldier who had seen too much to dwell on what could not be changed. The war had no time for grief, only for survival. He crawled along the ditch until the sounds of pursuit faded. Behind him, the Shermans advanced relentlessly, their tracks crushing the soil that German boots had once owned. The smell of cordite and burning oil clung to the air, a bitter perfume of defeat. Weber's notebook burned against his chest, where he had tucked it inside his tunic. The words he had written, his admission that the Americans had become something new, felt heavier than his sidearm. They were not just words of observation, they were prophecy. That night, hiding in the ruins of a farmhouse, Weber lit a single candle and wrote again, his handwriting jagged from exhaustion. "The enemy has found his teeth," he scrawled. "We underestimated his will, his industry, his speed of learning. What we see now is not the Sherman of Tunisia or Sicily. This is a new beast, and it will devour us if Berlin does not wake." He paused, the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. Outside, the distant rumble of American artillery rolled like approaching thunder. In Berlin, generals would dismiss such reports as exaggerations, or worse, cowardice. They had done it before when officers warned of Soviet tactics, when men wrote of endless Red Army waves crashing against German lines. But Weber knew what he had seen, and no propaganda could erase the image of his Tiger's armor splitting like paper under the force of an American shell. If his words were ignored, then more Tigers would burn. More crews would die inside machines once hailed as untouchable gods of war. The next morning, Weber rejoined what was left of his unit. Only 2 Tigers remained operational, their paint scorched, their crews hollow-eyed. The men asked what had happened on Hill 117, how their commander had survived when others had not. Weber did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked across the fields where smoke still rose in black pillars. Finally, he said quietly, "The Americans have changed. Do not underestimate them again." No one spoke after that. The silence was heavier than steel. Each man knew in his gut that the war had shifted, that the battlefield no longer belonged to them. The Tiger's roar, once the loudest sound of the armored war, was being drowned out by the steady, remorseless thunder of Shermans firing from beyond the horizon. And as the days stretched into weeks, and the Allies pressed deeper into France, Hauptmann Klaus Weber carried his notebook like a burden. Each entry was another wound, another confession that the Reich's great promise of invincible machines had been broken by an enemy they had mocked as weak and foolish. The truth was clear now. Germany was no longer the hunter. The Tiger had met its match, and the battlefield belonged to the Americans.